I never thought the hardest lesson I'd ever teach my daughter would come after she graduated. For 22 years, I worked double shifts, cleaning homes, doing night clerical work, and skipping meals just so I could put her through college. I told myself it would all be worth it, the pride of watching her walk across that stage, the feeling that I did right by her. But love doesn't always grow gratitude. Sometimes it grows expectation. When she came back from law school with new friends, new words, and a heart I barely recognized, she said something that broke me in half. "Mom, I'm entitled to what's mine." That's how it started, the lawsuit, the silence, and the slow unraveling of everything I thought motherhood meant. But this isn't a story about loss. It's about peace, the kind you earn when you stop begging to be understood. I was 38 when I buried my husband, and 40 by the time the world stopped asking how I was doing. After that, it was just me and my little girl, Mia. She was 12 then, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, and always dreaming bigger than the small world we lived in. I used to tell her, "Baby, the world won't hand you things easy. You'll have to walk toward them yourself." And she'd look at me with that confidence kids have before life teaches them caution and say, "Then I'll run, Mama." That girl gave me something to live for when the house got too quiet. Grief is strange. It creeps into corners and sits beside you at night, pretending to keep you company. But I didn't have the time to grieve too long. Bills still came. School lunches still needed packing. I worked mornings at the clinic as a cleaner and nights doing clerical work at a small freight office just outside Durham. It wasn't easy, but I told myself every sacrifice had a purpose. Every ache in my back was one more step toward Mia's future. I promised my husband the night before he passed, whispered it right there beside his hospital bed, that I'd give our daughter a life that would make him proud. I held that promise tighter than anything else in my life. Mia was a good student. Too good, maybe. She wanted to be a lawyer since she was 14. Used to argue with the TV whenever a courtroom show came on. "That's not how you cross-examine, Mama," she'd say, pointing at the screen, correcting the actors. I'd laugh and tell her she'd be the one standing in front of the jury one day, and she'd grin like she already knew it. When she got her acceptance letter to Chapel Hill, I cried right there at the mailbox. Neighbors thought something was wrong. I just told them, "No, baby, everything's right." I didn't know then that pride could come with its own kind of pain, the kind that costs you little pieces of yourself, one check, one favor, one sleepless night at a time. I remember the day I sold my car like it was yesterday. It was an old Toyota, nothing fancy, but it had been mine since my husband passed. I used to drive to the farmer's market every Sunday, buy fresh peaches, and sit by the lake with a book. That car held the last bit of freedom I had for myself. But when Mia called saying her dorm fees went up and her textbooks were more expensive than expected, I didn't hesitate. I listed the car that same night. The man who bought it was polite, said it still ran smooth for its age. I handed him the keys, smiled, and walked home with $3,200 in cash. I didn't cry that night. I told myself it wasn't loss. It was love. And that kind of love was supposed to come back around. After that, I started living smaller. Sold the big house and moved into a modest apartment closer to work. My coworkers thought I was saving for retirement, but truth was, every dollar had a destination. Tuition, books, housing, exam fees. I didn't even buy myself a winter coat that year. I'd just layer sweaters under my old gray one and tell folks I liked it that way. Sometimes at night, when the apartment got too still, I'd sit on the couch and imagine the sound of her voice coming through the door. "Mama, I made it through finals." Or "Mama, I got an A." But most nights, I'd just sit there listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet tick of the wall clock. That was my company. That and the thought that maybe one day, she'd look back and understand what I gave up so she could rise. Mia didn't come home much after her first semester. She said law school was too busy, that she needed to focus. I understood, Or at least I told myself I did. She'd call when she needed money or advice. And I gave both, gladly. I never wanted her to feel like she didn't have someone in her corner. Even when I was tired, even when my hands ached from scrubbing floors, I'd pick up that phone and tell her how proud I was. The first time she came home for the holidays, she looked different. Not in a bad way, just polished. Her words had changed. The little southern drawl she used to have was gone, replaced by something smoother, practiced. She carried herself like someone who belonged somewhere bigger. And I was proud. I really was. But there was a small ache in my chest that I couldn't explain, like she'd outgrown something I wasn't ready to let go of. She gave me a hug, quick and light, then started talking about her professors, her internship, and the kind of law she wanted to practice. I listened, smiling, trying to hold on to every detail. When she asked me if I could help her cover another semester's books, something about an unexpected lab fee, I didn't even blink. I went straight to my savings. I'd been putting away $50 a week, thinking maybe I'd finally take a trip somewhere quiet when she graduated. That dream disappeared the moment she said, "I just need a little more, Mama." When I transferred that money, I told myself again, sacrifice is love. I didn't realize how deeply I believed it, or how much it was costing me to hold on to that belief. Years passed that way, work, bills, small phone calls, fewer visits. I kept her pictures framed on my wall. Each one told a story. Freshman year, holding her acceptance letter, graduation cap tilted slightly on her curls, then one in a dark suit in front of a courthouse. Each frame cost me something different. A car. A home. A piece of me. But I never resented her. Not once. I'd stand in front of those photos and tell myself, she's living the life we prayed for. That was enough. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in my closet, I found the notebook where I used to write grocery lists and prayers. Inside, on the last page, I'd scribbled something I'd forgotten. When she wins, we all win. I stared at those words for a long time. Back then, I truly believed we were one. Her victories, my sacrifices, all tied together like threads in a quilt. But as the years stretched on, I started realizing something. Maybe she didn't see it that way anymore. Maybe I'd stitched us together so tightly that she never saw the effort it took to keep the seams from tearing. Still, when she called to say she'd passed the bar exam, I shouted, cried, and prayed all in one breath. She'd done it. My little girl had become a lawyer. She said, "Mama, I told you I'd make you proud." And I told her she already had. That night, I sat by the window, coffee in hand, looking out at the dark street below. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like relief. Maybe this was the part where life would slow down, where I could finally rest. I thought about visiting her in the city, maybe cooking her favorite Sunday dinner, baked chicken, collard greens, and cornbread. I even smiled, thinking how proud her daddy would have been if he could see her now. I didn't know that peace was the calm before a storm. Sometimes, when you've given everything, you don't realize you've got nothing left to lose. Not until someone tries to take what's left. But back then, I wasn't thinking about loss. I was just a mother who kept her promise, a tired woman who believed love, even one-sided, was worth it. And somewhere out there, my daughter was starting to believe that love was something she didn't owe anyone in return. That was the beginning of the distance between us. A distance that money could bridge for a while, until the day it couldn't. When Mia graduated law school, I thought the hard part was finally over. I pictured her coming home, maybe sitting on that same worn-out couch where she studied as a teenager, talking about her cases, her plans, her dreams. I thought we'd cook together like we used to, me stirring the pot, her tasting the sauce and saying it needed more kick. I thought we'd have those quiet mother-daughter mornings again, when we didn't need to say much, just sit side by side with our coffee and the hum of life in the background. But life has a way of reminding you that time doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes it just teaches them how to live without you. The first time Mia came home after graduation, she didn't look like the same girl who left for college. Her walk was sharper. Her tone, more polished, like she'd learned to speak in straight lines instead of the soft curves she grew up with. She pulled into the driveway in a sleek silver car, and before she even hugged me, she said, "Mama, you really should repaint this house. It's looking dated." She didn't mean harm. I knew that. But something about her words, that tone, that quick glance around like she was assessing a property, it stung. She was looking at the home I'd worked my whole life to keep, the same house her father and I built board by board, like it was something to be fixed, not something to be loved. She stayed only one night that weekend. Most of her time, she spent on her phone, pacing around the living room, talking to people I didn't know. Partners, clients, or maybe just friends who spoke the same language she now did. The kind that mixes confidence with distance. At dinner, she told me about her job at a downtown firm. Big clients, long hours, a partner who said she had potential. I listened, smiling like I was supposed to. But the more she spoke, the less she looked at me. Her words filled the room, but not her warmth. It felt like she was rehearsing a version of herself she'd built for someone else. When she left the next morning, she kissed my cheek quickly, like a polite gesture more than affection, and said, "You should really think about hiring someone to manage your bills, Mama. I can help set that up." I told her, "Baby, I've been paying bills since before you could walk." She smiled, that tight, half-patient smile people give when they think they're being kind. Then she was gone. After that, the visits got fewer. The calls got shorter. And when we did talk, it was like we were speaking from two different worlds. She'd talk about office politics and corporate ladders, and I'd tell her about the new flowers I planted out front. She'd nod politely, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. And maybe, in a way, I wasn't either. We were both pretending not to notice how far apart we'd grown. Months went by before I saw her again. This time, she brought a man with her, a colleague from work. Tall, well-dressed, confident in that way that comes from never missing a meal or worrying about rent. He called me Mrs. Johnson, like he was at a business meeting. Mia laughed at something he said about return on investment. And for a moment, I felt like an outsider in my own home. I served dinner, baked chicken and green beans, her favorite once upon a time, and watched her pick at the plate. She was careful not to eat too much, saying she was cutting back on carbs. I sat across from her, remembering how she used to go back for seconds and thirds, licking sauce off her fingers and laughing without shame. After they left, I sat in that quiet kitchen long after the dishes were done. The hum of the refrigerator was the only thing filling the air. I tried to tell myself this was just how life worked. Kids grow up, move on, make their own worlds. But this didn't feel like moving on. It felt like being left behind. The next time she called, her voice was bright, rehearsed, the kind people use when they're about to ask for something. "Mama," she said, "I've been looking into some financial strategies that could protect you long-term. With your age, it might be smart to put the house in my name, just for legal safety. You know, in case something happens." I paused, holding the phone to my ear, the sound of her words echoing in my head. "My house," I said slowly. She laughed lightly, as if I'd misunderstood. "It's just paperwork, Mama. It'll still be yours. But legally, it'd make more sense. You don't want to deal with all those estate complications later." Something about that conversation didn't sit right. The tone. The language. The way she said, "your age," like it was a number that meant weakness instead of wisdom. I told her I'd think about it. She sounded satisfied. Too satisfied. When we hung up, I just sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the wallpaper I'd been meaning to replace for years. The edges were peeling a little, but I loved it anyway. Every inch of that house carried fingerprints of my life. The corner where Mia took her first steps, the spot by the back door where her father used to hang his jacket. And she wanted it signed away. For legal safety. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through every room, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories. The house was quiet, but it felt like it was holding its breath. I thought about everything I'd given her, the long nights, the missed meals, the quiet prayers whispered into tired hands. I didn't regret it. Not one bit. But I started to realize something I'd been too blind to see before. I'd raised her to chase success, but not to understand sacrifice. The next morning, I called her. "Mia," I said, "you don't have to worry about the house. I'm safe. Always have been." She sighed softly, like she was speaking to a child. "Mama, you're being stubborn. I'm just trying to help." "I know, baby," I said. "But some things don't need help. They just need to be left alone." There was silence on the line, that heavy kind that says more than words ever could. When she finally spoke again, her voice was cool. "Okay, if that's what you want." That was the last real conversation we had for months. After that, her texts got shorter. The holidays passed without her visit. I sent her a card that Christmas, but it came back unopened, marked return to sender. I kept that envelope on my nightstand for weeks before finally putting it in a drawer. Every time I looked at it, something in me ached. Not the kind of pain that makes you cry, but the kind that settles into your bones. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals, and I realized the truth I'd been running from. The distance between us wasn't about time or miles or success. It wasn't about me being old or her being busy. It was about values, the invisible thing that used to connect us. Somewhere along the way, my daughter stopped speaking my language, the language of gratitude, of home, of quiet love. And I had no translator for what she'd become. I sat there until the lamp burned low, the shadows stretching long across the floor, and I whispered to myself, I didn't lose her to the world. I lost her to the person she became in it. That night, for the first time, I didn't pray for her success. I prayed for her soul. And as I closed my eyes, I knew something was shifting, not just in her, but in me too. Because sometimes the hardest part of love isn't the giving. It's learning how to stop giving to someone who's already taken everything. The day the letter came, the sky was the same pale, forgiving blue it always was in our little town. There was nothing dramatic about it, just a plain white envelope with my name typed across the front, like something you might get from the bank or the water company. I set the kettle on, folded a dish towel over my hands, and slid it open with the corner of a butter knife, like I had a dozen times before for bills and appointment reminders. I didn't expect my own daughter to be the thing that arrived inside. The words hit like cold iron. Not one line that said Mia or Mama, only legal language, clipped and precise, the kind of language that leaves no room for softness. Reimbursement for educational support. Claim for financial contribution. Emotional distress compensation. They used the word estate, as if my life could be reduced to a box of papers to be sorted after I was gone. Each phrase felt foreign and small and cruel, laid out on that paper like stones across a path I had thought we were walking together. I folded the letter again and tucked it inside the Bible on my nightstand, the same Bible my husband used to carry to church every Sunday. That book had kept our names, our dates, the little prayers we muttered at night for the children. Now the paper felt heavy under my hand, and for the first time in many years, my faith felt like a question more than an answer. It wasn't the money that surprised me. I had given. Of course I had given. That was what I promised the Lord I would do when I was a young widow with a child leaning on my skirts. I'd given every extra hour, every overtime paycheck, every sacrifice you can name. I sold the car when law school tuition rose. I took less medicine so the copay would be lower. I worked 2 jobs in 1 year just to keep her books paid. That was my promise. But to find those years listed under a heading that said, claim, as if our life together had been a ledger to be balanced, that felt like an erasure. It felt like Mia had decided some time ago that the memories were negotiable. When the phone rang that afternoon, my hands were still shaking from making tea. I watched the little screen light up with her name and I felt, for a moment, that we could step back into the ordinary. A laugh, a question about the recipe for Sunday dinner, something small and warm. I swallowed and tapped accept. "Hi, Mama." Her voice was cool. "I sent you a letter. My firm handled the paperwork. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." "Find out what way?" I heard the polite smile in her tone, the one she uses when she's on a call with someone from the office. "Mia, you can call me, tell me. We can talk." "I thought it would be better handled formally," she said. "There are legal protocols. I can explain." "No," I heard myself say, and I didn't even recognize my own voice. "No, you can't explain away a letter with a phone call. Not this one." She hesitated, like she was searching for a phrase her firm had taught her to use when a client grew emotional. "Mama, you know I love you. This is just the best way to protect you long term." I stood up and walked to the window, the kitchen light spilling over the sink, and watched a neighbor walk his dog down the lane. "Protect me," I whispered to myself. "From what, Mia?" "From living." She told me I was being dramatic, and then she was gone, the line clicking dead before I could ask the question that sat like a stone in my throat. When did my child become my opponent? That night I unfolded the letter and read it again, though the lines swam after the first few words. There were attachments, a list of figures, dates when support had supposedly been withdrawn or adjusted. The tone of the file was clinical, the kind of calm, bureaucratic voice that knows how to make mercy look like math. I put the paper back by the Bible and tried to pray, but the words didn't come easy. All I could hear was the tick of the mantel clock, marking time in a house that had once been full of chatter and argument and the clatter of pots. I called my sister. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, who had known me since I was a girl with pigtails. They listened. Mrs. Caldwell came over with a casserole and sat in my kitchen while I made another pot of tea. "Ruth," she said at last, "paper is paper. It's not the whole story. Don't let that letter make you small." Her words were kind. They warmed me like the tea, but they didn't change the way my hands trembled when I folded the napkins. The town talked in whispers. People are gentle here, but gossip is a neighbor's second language. I found a note on my doorstep one morning, a short card that read, "We're thinking of you. You do what's right." I folded it into my Bible too with the letter, because I didn't know where else to put the feeling that was building up inside me. Equal parts shame, equal parts fury, equal parts a grief that had no shape. I slept badly. I walked to church on Sunday not to seek comfort but to make sure I could sit still in a room full of people who would, at least for an hour, agree on something. There were practical things to do. A letter like that does not dissolve if you tuck it in a drawer and hope it goes away. I met with a lawyer, a soft-spoken man who had been recommended to me by the pastor. He explained things that made my head swim. Statute of limitations, precedent, possible defenses. He asked me to bring bank statements, receipts, cancelled checks. He asked me to remember dates. The word defend felt strange in my mouth when the person I might be defending myself against had once fallen asleep on my shoulder to the radio's slow songs. "What do you want to do, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked gently, tapping his pen on a notepad. I looked at the legal form again, its cold print, and then at the photo on my wall of Mia in her cap and gown, laughing with flour on her cheek from the night before graduation when we'd made a cake and she'd insisted on frosting half of it in blue. I thought of the nights I'd sat up and read until the streetlights blurred, the mornings I'd ironed her shirts while the coffee percolated, the times I skipped a dentist appointment because the tuition check needed to clear. "I don't want a suit in the family," I said finally. But I also don't want to be erased. He nodded. There are ways to respond that protect your interests without turning this into a war. Mediation, for example. Or we can set up a conversation, formal but private. I wanted to believe him, wanted to be the kind of woman who could handle this with paperwork and polite legal terms. But on the drive home, I felt like someone trying to catch my breath underwater. I thought about how often I had told Mia, "You do not owe your life to me." I had meant it as encouragement. Go, live your dreams. I had never imagined I would one day have to remind her I was not a line item on a balance sheet. I kept the letter folded beside the Bible and read it at night the way some people read their name carved into a tree or a faded photograph. I stared at the words until they looked unfamiliar, until I began to invent softer meanings for them. Reimbursement became, "You taught me how to give." Emotional distress became, "We both carried weight." It was a small act of mercy toward myself, an attempt to translate cold phrases back into flesh and memory. Days bled into one another. Neighbors brought casseroles. The pastor stopped by and sat with me under the shade of the magnolia tree and listened as I spoke, not to ask what I was going to do but to hear the way my voice trembled and then steadied. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest battles are the quiet ones." Mia called less and less. When she did pick up, our conversations were like two trains passing in the night. Polite, slightly off, with no stop where we could exchange anything real. Once, in a moment that felt almost like the old times, she asked, "Mama, are you eating okay?" And I told her yes. I didn't tell her about the letters, the meetings, the nights I sat with the Bible and the paper and considered how to respond. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of my pain. People asked me how I could let it go. People who had not sold a car or missed a night's sleep to keep a tuition check from bouncing didn't always understand how quietly theft can happen. Not the bright, exciting theft of money in a bank heist, but the slow, polite kind where gratitude becomes entitlement and love is converted into obligation. I practiced saying things out loud that I wasn't sure I entirely believed. I did right by my child. I did more right than I knew how to do. If this is my test, then I will take it with dignity. I said them in the kitchen, to the sink, while I scrubbed plates, while I folded laundry. Saying them was not the same as feeling them, but it was a start. There were nights when the familiar ache of betrayal would swell up and leave me gasping, as if someone had reached into my chest and rearranged the furniture there. I would sit at the table with the lamp low and think of every small kindness I had done, each one an invisible stitch in the fabric of our life, and I would wonder where the unraveling had started. Was it the first time she chose a scholarship over a Sunday dinner? The first time she asked me to sign papers without reading them? Or was it always there, waiting in the wings, the human tendency to quantify everything, to put a price on love until the numbers look like facts? I kept the letter folded under the Bible for a long time. I read it in the mornings while the house was still cool, and in the afternoons while the sun warmed the porch. Sometimes I'd bring it to the window and hold it up to the light, trying to read between the lines, as if there might be a handwritten note tucked beneath the legalese with her old looping letters that said, "Mama, I'm sorry." There was no apology. There was only silence, and that silence began to feel like a room I had to learn to live in. I thought of the friends who had been through divorce, the widows who had buried sons, the men who had lost businesses. We all knew that life could hurt in ways that did not make for good newspaper prints. We carried our wounds the way people carry warm stones in their pockets in winter. Secretly, steadily, because they keep you tethered to feeling. I suppose the worst part, the part that kept me awake some nights, was not the legal threat. It was the sense that a child I had raised with prayers and second helpings and midnight consolations could be trained, quietly, by a world that teaches you to measure worth in contracts and leverage. There was a betrayal not just of me but of the lesson I had tried to teach, that some things are given without tally. Yet in the middle of that soft, grinding hurt, a different feeling began to creep in, like something small and stubborn pushing up through soil. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief. It was steadiness. Maybe it was the same thing my husband used to call resilience. I found myself humming while I folded shirts. I started walking around the block again, letting the air fill my lungs. I placed the Bible and the letter on the shelf and, for the first time in a while, I read the verses not for absolution but to remind myself there were stories of survival in there too. I didn't know then what the next step would be. I didn't know if I would fight the claim, if I would mediate, if I would forgive in some legal sense, or simply refuse to let paper rewrite my life. What I did know was how quiet the house looked when the sun went down and the kitchen clock ticked on. I knew how the photograph of Mia in her cap made me smile and ache at once. I knew the difference between a debt and a daughter, and I knew I wasn't ready to have that difference blurred by a lawyer's letter. So I kept the papers, folded and patient beside my Bible, and I listened to the house breathe. I waited. Not for her apology, not yet, but for whatever moment would teach me what to do next. I had been a giver for most of my life. I would find out, in time, what it meant to be a woman who could also take care of herself. I didn't sleep much the night I made my decision. I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, the same lamp my husband used to read under, the warm glow spreading just enough light for me to see the papers scattered in front of me. Receipts, loan statements, tuition confirmations, bank transfers, handwritten notes from teachers who thanked me for staying involved. It wasn't anger that made me stay awake. It was a strange, settling calm, the kind that comes when you finally stop running from the truth. For weeks I had wrestled with myself. Everybody I talked to had an opinion. Some said I should fight hard, hire the toughest lawyer in town, make a public case out of it. Others told me to let it go, pretend it never happened, and hope my daughter eventually came to her senses. But neither of those paths felt right to me. I wasn't a fighter by nature, and I wasn't a fool either. I needed something quieter, something that belonged to me. So I brewed a pot of tea and started organizing the years of my life as a mother into neat little piles. There were tuition receipts, so many that I had to stop and blink when I realized just how much paper could hold years of sacrifice. I found the folder from her freshman year, still smelling faintly of the old drawer it lived in. I remembered how proud I'd been to tuck the very first tuition statement inside, thinking to myself, "We're really doing it, baby girl." Back then, I didn't know that pride could turn into something that stung this sharply later on. Then there were bank statements, the ones that showed the withdrawals I made to help her with rent when she moved into her first apartment near campus. I remembered the excitement in her voice when she told me she'd found a place with just enough sunlight and not too many noisy neighbors. I had smiled so wide, promising her I'd visit soon, though I never did. I didn't want to embarrass her with how simple I lived compared to the new world she was stepping into. I found the letter from her scholarship committee, thanking me for writing such a heartfelt recommendation. There was the photo of her first day of law school, printed out on glossy paper, her smile bright, her eyes full of hope. I traced my finger around her face and wondered how we had ended up with court papers instead of celebrations. But the thing that got me the most was a wrinkled piece of paper tucked between two folders, a note she had scribbled to me when she was 12. "Mama, thank you for believing in me." The handwriting was crooked and messy, the kind only a child can make before the world presses manners into them. I held that little note for a long time before placing it gently at the back of the folder. By the time the sun hinted at a new dawn, I had assembled everything into a simple, plain manila folder. No binder, no labels except one that I wrote in steady handwriting, Mother's Record. I didn't choose that name to convince anyone of anything. I chose it because that's what it was, a record of what it means to love someone even when they forget how to love you back. When morning finally came, I showered, put on my Sunday best sweater, and tied a scarf around my neck. Not because I wanted to look important, but because I wanted to walk into that courthouse feeling like the woman I used to be, strong, steady, and whole. The courthouse smelled the way old buildings do, a mix of floor polish, paper, and something that reminded me of chalk dust from my school days. People walked past me in a hurry, their heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. I held the folder close to my chest and stepped up to the clerk's window. The young woman behind the glass looked up. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" I slid the folder across the counter. "This is my response," I said quietly. She looked confused. "Your lawyer didn't submit it electronically?" "I don't have one," I answered. "I'm representing myself." She blinked. "Do you want to attach a statement? Or schedule a hearing?" "No," I said. "Everything she needs to understand is already inside." The clerk hesitated, glancing down at the folder, then back at me. "Should I mark it as evidence?" I nodded. "Mark it however you need to. She'll understand when she reads it." There wasn't anything else to say. I didn't need to defend myself with arguments or legal terms. I didn't need to build a case. I had built one already, over decades, with every decision that had pointed toward my daughter. Love doesn't need a courtroom. It speaks for itself. I turned around and walked out. My steps were slow, but I didn't feel weak. I felt something else entirely, like I had finally put down a weight I'd been carrying for longer than I realized. Outside, the morning air felt cool against my face, and I breathed it in like someone who had earned it. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. Not Mrs. Caldwell, not my sister, not the pastor. I didn't want advice or sympathy or applause. I wanted silence, the kind that lets you hear your own heart again after too long of ignoring it. I made a simple lunch, watered my plants, and slipped into the rhythm of a quiet afternoon. Later that day, I sat on the porch and watched the neighborhood children play tag in the street. Their laughter rose and fell like birdsong, and something inside me softened. I thought about how simple the world had felt when I was Mia's age, when playing fair and loving people was enough to make a life. I wondered what had changed in her, what had hardened her, what had convinced her that safety could only be found in ownership. But I also thought about something else, something that had been growing in me slowly, the understanding that I couldn't save her from herself. A mother can guide and push and pray, but she cannot reach inside a grown child and rearrange their heart. That's a work only life can do. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I whispered to myself, "Truth is enough. It has to be." Maybe Mia would read those papers and feel ashamed. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd see the receipts and remember the nights I stayed up sewing clothes to save money. Maybe she'd see the tuition payments and recall the days she cried in my arms because she thought she wouldn't get into law school. Or maybe she'd shrug it off, bury herself in work, convince herself she had done nothing wrong. But the outcome didn't belong to me anymore. I had placed the truth in front of her. I had laid my years bare. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sliver of peace in the knowing that I didn't respond with anger. I didn't match her coldness. I didn't let bitterness rewrite who I was. My quiet defense wasn't a counterattack, it was a mirror. And now, all I could do was wait for her to see her own reflection in it. The evening closed in, soft and blue, and I stayed on the porch until the sky dimmed, holding on to that calm like the one thing I still had the right to keep. The months after the courthouse moved differently than I expected. I thought I would spend my days waiting for a single phone call, an apology, a soft voice on the other end saying she'd been wrong. Instead, I learned how quiet grief can be, and how slow healing sometimes is. The case drifted into its own life without me. News articles mentioned names and legal terms. My name was a small footnote. My daughter's name lived larger in those headlines for a time, tied to dates and accusations, and the world that had applauded her achievement now measured her in a different way. I read the headlines once, twice, then stopped. There was nothing in them for me. When the scandal reached her firm, it was not sudden so much as inevitable, a slow loosening that finally showed the seams. Clients left. Partners whispered in boardrooms. The kind of conversations that used to be polite and businesslike turned sharp and cold. I learned later that Mia had been suspended, then let go. A story in the paper quoted an anonymous source about ethical lapses related to conduct in family cases. I didn't call her. I couldn't. I folded the clippings and put them into a drawer where old bills used to live, and I went on with the ordinary tasks of living. No apology came. There were no calls that asked for forgiveness or showed shame. There was only the silence that felt like weather, a steady, changeless thing that settled over the house and into the bones. I tried not to let it define me. I boxed up the rest of her things the way I had boxed so many other chapters in my life. Gently, thoroughly, with a sort of reverence. Her childhood clothes, her first briefcase, the little ceramic mug with a law school logo that she never used because she claimed it was too sentimental. I kept one thing, a graduation tassel, frayed near the knot where excitement had once tied it to hope, and put the rest on the moving truck. Selling a house after a lifetime inside its rooms is like untying a knot you forgot you had been holding on to. I walked through each room and named the memories quietly. The sun came into the kitchen the same way it always had, catching the varnished edge of the table. I could still see her small hands reaching for the cookie jar, hear the echo of laughter on late summer evenings, the way she would hum when she was concentrating on a puzzle or a sentence. Those things lived in the wood and the plaster. I took them with me, not on the truck, but folded into the way I breathed. I chose the coastal town because I'd always loved the coast, even if in my life I'd seldom seen it except in postcards. The town was small and patient. The kind of place where the bakery owner knew your name after 2 visits, and the post office clerk smiled as if remembering a familiar face from a photograph. My new house was modest, a pale clapboard with a little yard that welcomed a few brave marigolds. The front window looked out toward a stretch of road that led to the water. Mornings there smelled like salt and coffee, and the light felt forgiving. I found work at the public library, which suited me in ways I didn't notice at first. The library was a quiet kingdom, full of people who loved stories and the soft hush of pages turning. My duties were small at first, shelving returned books, answering the occasional question about where the biographies lived, but the rhythm of it steadied me. I liked folding spines inward the way a seamstress folds fabric, aligning titles like the notes of a song. There were regulars who came in and sat at the big windows to read the paper, children who tugged at sleeves asking for picture books, and a librarian named June who taught me the names of every patron who preferred mysteries to romance. They didn't ask about my life. They simply welcomed my presence. That, more than anything, felt like a healing. In the evenings I walked the beach. The coast teaches patience. The tide never hurried, though it transformed everything in quiet, relentless ways. I would watch the gulls wheel over the water and think of how small the world looked from the edge. Sometimes I took a paperback and sat on a bench, letting the sea air settle my thoughts. Other times I walked with no book at all, letting the sand stick coolly to my feet. The horizon was honest. It never pretended that the past could be rewritten. It only showed me how much space there was beyond it. I began to write letters. At first I told myself they were exercises, a way to untangle memory. I bought a stack of stationery with seagrass patterns on the edges and a pen that fit the curve of my hand. Each night, after I had closed the library and made a cup of tea, I sat at my small table and wrote to Mia like I used to when she was a child and away at summer camp. I told her about the weather here, about the woman at the library who knitted bookmarks for the kids, about the marigolds that had stubbornly returned despite an indifferent season. I wrote about the little things that mattered to me. The neighbor who left me jars of pickles, the sound of the ice cream truck on hot afternoons, how the moon looked silver and fat when it hung over the harbor. I wrote without the expectation that she would ever read these words. These letters became a map to myself. In them I wrote the memories that had no place on a balance sheet. The bus rides with Mia when she was 5, the way she would press her head against my shoulder when thunder rolled through town, the small, clumsy conversations we had about fairness and kindness. I wrote about selling my car and the afternoon we shared pie when her law school acceptance came. I wrote the things that made me love her, the stubbornness that would not be tamed, The way she always packed an extra blanket in the car, just in case. Sometimes I read the letters aloud into the kitchen late at night, my voice a thread knitting me back to myself. Other times I folded them neatly and placed them in a shoebox beneath the bed. There was no malice in my letters, no recrimination. I refused to make them a ledger of hurts. Instead, they were a way to preserve the person she had been before the world taught her to trade tenderness for contracts. On paper, I tried to keep both versions of her, the small girl who collected seashells and the woman who could argue in a courtroom with cool efficiency. I wanted to remember her whole, even the parts that hurt now. People asked me gently whether I intended to send any of the letters. My sister, when she visited, paused by the shoebox and coughed lightly. "You know you could mail one," she said, fishing for a permission that wasn't mine to give. I shook my head. "Not yet," I replied. "They're for me, for remembering." It turned out I needed the letters more than I needed reconciliation. They kept me honest. They reminded me of the shape of my own heart, how much of it had been given away and how I could still hold the rest. They taught me to be patient with the idea that people change on their own timetables, not always because of apologies or confrontations. Change is often private and slow. Sometimes it arrives with a letter, sometimes it doesn't. Days became quieter and nicer in small, ordinary ways. I volunteered for story hour at the library and learned I could make even the most wriggly child sit by reading about bear families and bedtime stars. I mended sweaters for old men who came in and asked for help, and the simple gratitude of their thanks returned to me like sunlight. I started to plant a small bed of herbs by the kitchen door. Basil and rosemary have a way of perfuming a room with the promise of dinner. I made friends slowly, in the way chairs in a waiting room shift into neighbors, by shared greetings, by passing each other on the sidewalk, by small acts of trust. Every now and then I would imagine Mia walking into the library, eyes soft with something like regret, asking to sit and listen to me read aloud. Sometimes I allowed myself to hope for that. More often I accepted that maybe she would never come. The world had taught her a different vocabulary. My letters were not bait. They were a record, a careful human attempt to hold the truth. When people ask me now how I coped, I tell them that there is a difference between surviving and living. Surviving is the bare act, putting one foot in front of the other, signing forms, paying bills. Living is the slow accumulation of moments that say you still exist with purpose. The library gave me both the structure to survive and the reasons to live. The mornings when a child hugs a chapter book close like treasure, the afternoons when someone asks for a poem recommendation, the quiet satisfaction of dusting the biographies and knowing I'm keeping stories safe. Sometimes I would walk the shoreline at dusk and imagine the letters drifting into the tide, pages carried away by the current to somewhere neither of us could follow. I liked that image, the idea that words could travel beyond me, not as accusations or pleas, but as offerings of memory sent into a world that doesn't always answer. It made me feel less alone. Months folded into one another. The scandal that had shadowed her name settled into news archives and then memory for others. But for me, it was only a chapter, sharp and defining for a while, yes, but not the whole book. I found myself laughing at small things again. I discovered a cafe that made a better coffee than any I'd tasted in town, and the barista learned my order after a single visit. Tea, no sugar, extra lemon. The barista also learned to listen when I needed a quiet, friendly face after a long, lonely morning. I began to say good morning to the fisherman who walked by with tackle boxes and to the artist who painted seascapes by the pier. On a grey afternoon when rain made small bright rivers on the pavement, I opened another letter and wrote, simply, "I am learning to be gentle with myself." It felt like a confession and a promise both. I folded it carefully and placed it with the others. The shoebox grew heavier with ink and memory. It was a strange kind of wealth. I still thought of Mia every day. Mothers do not unlove those they have raised. But the way I carried her changed. Once I bore her on my back like a burden that defined my every step. Now I carried her like a photograph in the pocket of my coat, close enough to touch, small enough not to obscure the path ahead. I began to feel lighter, yes, but also stronger in a way that surprised me. There was a resilience I had not noticed until it arrived quietly. The ability to keep loving without losing myself. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit at the window and watch the town go to sleep, the harbor lights blinking like slow stars. I would touch the edge of a letter and listen to the sound of waves against the shore, and for a moment the world balanced. The past, the present, the possible future. I whispered small truths into that gathering dark, the same way I used to whisper lullabies to a child too old to need them but not too old to still appreciate the sound. There would be more days, I knew. There would be moments when the ache returned like a wave hitting a cliff. There would be choices to make about whether to send a letter, whether to answer a knock at the door if she ever came back. For now, though, I kept writing. The letters held me. The library kept me. The sea taught me to be patient. And in the quiet of this new life, I was beginning to learn that sometimes the silence that follows a wound is not empty. Sometimes it speaks. The morning the envelope arrived, the sky was the color of faded cotton. Soft, pale, settling quietly over the coastal town like a blanket someone had laid out gently. I remember hearing the mail truck pull up, its familiar brake hiss drifting into my kitchen. I didn't think anything of it at first. Most of the letters I got these days were simple things. A notice from the library, a flyer about a community festival, a postcard from my sister in Atlanta. My life had become small in the best way. Predictable, steady, peaceful. But when I opened the door and picked up the mail, there it was. A small, ivory envelope with my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in far too long. My heart didn't leap or freeze. It softened, as if making space for something delicate. I brought it inside and sat at my little table by the window, the morning light stretching across the wood. For a moment, I just held it between my fingers, feeling the slight weight inside. Part of me wanted to set it aside and pretend I didn't see it. Another part, the mother in me, needed to know. When I finally opened it, I found a single photograph. Mia stood there, holding a newborn baby close to her chest. Her hair was pulled back, her cheeks tired, but her smile had something familiar in it. Something from years ago, when she was still the girl who ran up to me after school, breathless with every detail of her day. In the picture, her eyes looked softer than I remembered, like something inside her had shifted. I turned the photo over, expecting maybe a date, maybe a name. Instead, there were only 2 words written in blue ink. I'm sorry. My breath caught, not because I was surprised, but because I'd been waiting so long to hear those words that I wasn't sure anymore if they would ever come. My eyes filled, gently, the way water gathers at the edge of a tide before it rolls in. I didn't sob or cover my face. I let the tears rest there, warm at the corners. Then I placed the photograph on the windowsill where the morning sun could touch it. I've been waiting for that, I whispered. And I meant it, not in bitterness, but in relief, like a door that had been stuck for too long had finally eased open. For a long while, I just sat there, letting my hands rest on the table, letting the quiet hold me. The kettle hummed behind me, but I didn't get up. I thought about everything that had come before, the long nights working overtime, the sacrifices that nobody saw, the betrayal that cut deeper because it came from the very person I had loved most in this world. I thought about the silence that stretched between us, all those months with no calls, no explanations, just a distance that grew and grew until it no longer resembled anything like family. But this small photograph, this tiny apology written in a trembling hand, it wasn't a fix. It wasn't a return to what we had been. It was something gentler, smaller, like the first warm day after winter. A reminder that healing doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like acknowledgement. Sometimes it looks like a crack in the wall where light gets in. I carried the picture around the house as I did my chores that afternoon. Every room looked different with that quiet hope tucked against my palm. Even the air felt different, softer somehow. I thought about the baby in her arms, a child who had no part in any of this, a child who would grow up one day and ask questions about family and forgiveness. Maybe, just maybe, this was Mia's way of saying she wanted to start over. Not perfectly, not completely, but something. That evening, after closing the library, I walked to the shore. The ocean had become like a friend to me, constant, honest, unafraid to take its time. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the kind of sunset that made even the seagulls slow down. I sat on my usual bench, slipped the photograph from my pocket, and held it up to the fading light. There was something comforting in seeing Mia like that. Softer, holding something precious, smiling in a way that didn't feel rehearsed or hardened by ambition. I realized then that maybe all those letters I wrote had helped me more than I knew. They had carved out space in my heart where bitterness could have settled. They had kept her human in my memory, even when her choices had hurt me deeply. The waves rolled in, slow and rhythmic, like breathing. I let their sounds settle into me, the way I always did. The breeze felt cool on my cheeks, drying the last traces of tears that had lingered there hours before. The bench creaked softly under my weight. For the first time in a long while, I felt not just peaceful, but proud. Proud of the way I'd chosen to walk through everything without letting anger destroy what was left of my spirit. Proud that my love had stayed intact, even if my heart had been bruised. Proud that the life I'd built here, small as it was, felt like mine. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if Mia would call, or visit, or let me hold that baby one day. I didn't even know if the letter was a beginning or an ending. But I did know this. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting for anyone to decide my worth or measure my goodness. I had already chosen my peace, and peace had chosen me back. The last trace of sunlight slipped beneath the water, and I felt something loosen gently inside me. The last knot of worry, the last strain of wondering what I did wrong. Life had been hard, yes, but it had also been beautiful in quiet ways. The kind of beauty you only notice after everything falls apart and you realize you're still standing. I touched the edge of the photograph one more time and whispered, "Thank you." Not because everything was healed, not because everything was forgiven, but because sometimes the smallest gesture, 2 words, a picture, a soft return, is enough to remind you that love doesn't disappear. It simply changes shape. I walked home slowly, letting the warm glow of the street lamps guide me. When I reached my little house, I placed the photograph on the shelf above my bed and turned off the light. For the first time in a long while, sleep came easily. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.